Hi, welcome back to Computers, Ethics, and Society. I'm Tom, and today we are talking about the topic of privacy, right? So this is obviously a big topic when it comes to the internet and social media. There are many concerns about this when it comes to data harvesting and just in general, people having greater reach. Any general citizen can kind of reach millions and millions of people very easily, and so it sets up a situation where one's privacy can be breached and also or violated, and the sense of what counts as privacy has shifted quite a bit when it comes to widespread use of computers and social media and the internet. So and the other thing I want to mention right at the outset is that, noticing that we only have a couple weeks left, and we're bringing in a new topic. Privacy is something that I bring up at this point because it really goes hand in hand with the idea of free speech, right? And I'll talk about this at the end, but a phenomenon like doxing, for example, where you share someone's private information on the internet, one might think that you're entitled to do this because you have free speech, and then another person might think you're not entitled to do it because you're not respecting someone's privacy. And so there is a clear conflict there. This plays out in different ways. And so I would really think about this material as adding a layer to concerns about free speech, right? Especially when it comes to the final paper, which is on free speech and hate speech on the internet. So the initial thing to mention when it comes to privacy, so this unit is just an introduction to this concept, which is a difficult concept, right? Uh, the first thing to kind of notice about privacy is that I say in my notes, it has social markers or lives in social space. What does that mean? Well, there are certain things about privacy that seem to correspond to like proximity or spatial orientation, right? So, my house. I don't want you to come into my house uninvited, right? Because that's kind of my space. But if I do invite you, then I give you permission, and then it's not a breach of privacy for you to say, come and sit in my living room and have a cup of coffee. However, if I, leave the room for a minute and I come back and you're wandering around in my bedroom or something, then it seems like that's still a breach of privacy. But I've invited you into my house, so there's social markers there, right? And it would be less of a breach of privacy if you were walking on my front lawn, and context really matters, right? So, for example, it's okay for students to look at me and stare at me when I'm lecturing, right? Because that's the context. They're supposed to be paying attention to what I'm saying. But if I was after class having lunch and those same students were standing around staring at me eating lunch, right, that would seem to be a invasion of privacy, right? So those markers, what counts as an invasion of privacy, is not really limited to spatial proximity, but it's more about the social context, about when it's okay to behave in a certain way, when it's okay to look or touch or whatever, something, right? And I use a good analogy is the idea of property, right? It's similar in this respect, in the sense that what you own can be understood in part by spatial proximity, right? The things in my house I own, the clothes I'm wearing I own, the things in my bag, right? But my truck is still my truck, even if it's parked across town, right? You can't claim my truck because I was gone from it for a period of hours, or I was more than 100 yards away from it, right? It just doesn't make sense, right? It's a space of kind of mutual recognition. And so privacy is like this. And because of that, privacy and the standards of privacy, what counts as someone's private information or private belongings or whatever it is, right, shifts quite a bit as the social context shifts, right? Depending on, how good of friends you are with someone, whether your family, this kind of stuff. But also, a big one has been the internet, right? There was not a question about use of people's data so much, a little bit, but not so much before social media, right? And then, at that point now, there's all kinds of data that it seems like the places I go should not be tracked, right? It seems like the things I say on direct messaging should not be watched or read by the person except for the intended person. And as you open up these platforms or mediums of communication and different norms around them, you have different senses of privacy, right? So it would seem a breach of privacy if someone hacked into my direct messaging on Facebook. But if someone looks at my profile on Facebook, then it's okay, right? There's a whole different kind of trajectory to how we understand privacy, right? And again, when it comes to privacy, we are concerned with it in a philosophical sense. And so we're concerned with, what is really this value based on, right? And so I mentioned three aspects of privacy, right? One is that you have the freedom from intrusion, right? So you don't want someone to be able to just come in and do whatever in your personal space or whatever, in your office or your house or your car or whatever, in your conversation, these kinds of things. The second thing is, there's a concern to be able to control the information about oneself, right? There are certain things that, if I have, say, a medical condition, we typically think that it's up to me to tell someone, right? And that even if you are a good friend or family member, you shouldn't be spreading that around without my permission, at least, right? And then the third one is freedom from surveillance, which is basically, not you should have a certain kind of freedom to not be watched, right? Now, these are three kind of concerns, aspects to privacy, and there is a question about whether there really is. I mean, the idea is that privacy would be the value behind all these things, right? Freedom from intrusion, control of information, freedom from surveillance, all these kind of things are just kind of draped around the idea of privacy, and privacy is the core value there. But there is a question about whether or not really privacy is its own value, or whether or not it can be reduced to other values. And you kind of need to get clear about this because of those kind of, what would you say, gray or blurry borders, right? The way in which it lives in social space and the way in which our kind of limits of privacy kind of shift all the time. It seems like there is a clear desire to have a sense of what the real value is that's grounding those changes and those alterations, right? And one view is that, obviously privacy is itself a core principle, and that all these other kind of concerns kind of fall around it, right? And this is what is called the coherence view. This is not in our text, but this is some kind of in the realm of philosophy, right? The camp, and when it comes to talking about privacy. And this is the idea that there is one coherent single kind of value, privacy, and that everything else is kind of tracking this one idea of privacy. Of course, this has a disadvantage of being able to ground privacy in something more concrete. It's just, it's hard to see what counts as like an objective sense of privacy, right? But there's another view, an alternative view, which is called a reductionist view. And this is the idea that privacy is really not its own value. It's really just a kind of collection of a couple of different values. And then we kind of lump them together, and then we kind of call it privacy. But if you look really closely, privacy really has to do with other values. And usually these are things like autonomy, right? My freedom to be able to do things, right? So if you think of freedom from surveillance, freedom from intrusion, control of information about oneself, you might think that all really has to do with my sense of being able to do what I want with my information, with my body, with my, all these kinds of things. The other kind of value you might think that privacy reduces to is property, right? So you might think about your information as your property in a certain sense, right? Your belongings, something like ownership, right? Or your body, right? If someone touches you in an unwanted way, that's an invasion of privacy. You might think of your body as your property in a certain sense, right? So those are like two main values, principles that you might think are really at the root of something like privacy. So those are two alternative views, and this is just kind of like chopping up this concept a little bit. As I said, it's an introduction to privacy, so we're just kind of digging into it and trying to pull it apart a little bit. Now, there are some arguments against this idea of privacy and reasons why you might think that privacy is not a good value to hold up on its own right, right? And so some of these come from the reductionist view, that people are really concerned with other issues, like I said, privacy, autonomy, property and autonomy. And why does that matter? Well, because we're likely to kind of miss the boat on what our real concerns are, and this is going to shift our debates, and we're going to end up spinning our wheels looking for this value of privacy that we're not really concerned with as much as we are concerned with other things like autonomy. The second kind of concern from the reductionists is that if privacy is kind of very subjective, right? We shouldn't spend a lot of time trying to defend it, because we're not going to find kind of an objective sense of privacy that we all agree on. And also the other thing about the reductionist view is that since privacy, they think, is just kind of this weird hodgepodge of different values, it ends up leading to all kinds of misleading claims and positions, and people who are very kind of staunch about privacy for no real good reason, or the opposite, right? People who just don't care about their privacy and don't have a good sense of respecting their own autonomy and the autonomy of others and stuff like this. There is also a feminist critique that I bring up here, that privacy is oftentimes a value that's used for kind of bad things, right? So it often is used as a shield for unethical or unlawful behavior, right? So, you have a billionaire who's doing all kinds of bad things, and you want to know something about, their business dealings or something like this, or their personal life, that seems to be kind of very bad for a lot of people, and they say, well, this is my private business, right? And people oftentimes shield unlawful behavior as much as they can behind the idea of privacy. So one might think that privacy also has a lot of bad, it can be used for a lot of bad things as a value. And then the other thing, the other kind of feminist critique is that, privacy is kind of gives pride of place to kind of like a public realm of life, right? And so people who work out in the public tend to get afforded a certain sense of privacy that people who don't have that professional life kind of aren't afforded, right? So some might think that, when you are working from home, or or working in the home, you're doing domestic labor, these kinds of things, that people don't think you're entitled to the same kind of privacy about your goings on and whatnot. So that's another concern, something to think about in terms of where privacy really takes hold. Um, and then the last thing to mention here, well, second to last thing, is that again, constitutional privacy and the idea of privacy as a value are different things, right? So constitutional privacy has to do with the Fourth Amendment, and that has to do with interpreting the Fourth Amendment and its role in facilitating democracy or personal sovereignty or sovereignty of the state, this kind of stuff, improper search and seizure, these kinds of things. But privacy in general is what we've been talking about. And this is just a value of common decency, and has to do with norms around respecting someone's space, things, information, that kind of stuff, right? So they definitely overlap, and we do want our laws to reflect these values, but it is a different conversation of whether or not the Fourth Amendment has been violated versus a person's sense of privacy. Okay. And so the last thing I will talk about is this idea of doxing, right? This is a phenomenon. Doxing is when you go online and you post someone's personal information, and sometimes their address, personal phone number, email, whatever it is. Maybe it's historical information about where you grew up, or things that might run counter to the persona that you make on social media platforms or whatever. And you might think, especially in the case where the person that you are doxing is a bad actor, right, of some sort, you might think that it's kind of vindicated as a case of free speech, right? It's definitely not defamation. You're not saying anything untrue. And it can definitely be argued that although this is kind of disruptive in its orientation, that you can argue that it's not intended to be malicious, right? You're just putting someone's email address up, or just saying something that happened to this person at some point or whatever. And so it's not really unlawful, but you might think that it's really an invasion of privacy. And so on the one hand, you might think it's a case of free speech. On the other hand, you might think it's an invasion of privacy, right? And so with both these values, how do you find this middle ground, and where do different cases of doxing fall on this kind of trajectory of being, fair, kind of free speech versus, a improper invasion of privacy and these kinds of things. And so this adds just another layer to this idea of free speech, right? And that we have other values that do conflict, and it's not so easy to just say that everyone should just be able to say whatever they want to do, whatever they want, whenever they want to, right? Especially if you want to at the same time say that people have the right to privacy, right? And also, another kind of dimension to this is the disclaimers that a lot of us sign or click when we use a social media platform or an app or whatnot. Oftentimes those basically say that we give permission to use our information in all kinds of different ways, and sell our data and this kind of things. And you might think that clicking on that is a case of free speech, right? You are exercising your autonomy in doing that. And then at the same time, people who do that might also think that they are still their privacy is being violated in different ways, right? And there are certain disanalogies to the way, our other, what would you say, consumer activities function, right? So when you walk into the grocery store, no one makes you sign a waiver, says that they're going to track every aisle you go down and every item that you pick up and look at, right? So it's not the same, but also if you want to have those values of freedom of expression and privacy together, there's a lot of work that has to do in the in between. And so I bring that up again. It's another layer, it's another dimension. It shows how complex this idea of free speech is, and how computing technology, the internet, social media have really compounded this complexity, right? And just added many, many different facets. And okay, and so that's it for this week. All right. Hope you're all doing well. See you soon.